Okay, today we want to cover Chapter 9 in your books. It deals primarily with international trade. If you remember earlier in the course, we talked about international trade being part of how we used the production possibilities curve or production possibilities frontier, whichever you want to call it, how we use that to determine which countries would have the comparative advantage for particular products and therefore be the exporter. We want to go a little further than that one did and concentrate more on international trade itself rather than the concept of how we get there. So some of it will be a repeat of what you've seen already, and other pieces of it will be new. But we're going to take international trade and look at it a little bit more in depth. So let's start. Now, the basis for international trade is basically three things. First of all, resources are not the same among all the nations. It's not only not the same, it's not evenly matched. In the United States, we're fortunate. We are very well blessed with land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurial ability, and a very large size. There are some nations that are very small and don't have the resources that we have. So in the States, we're very lucky to have the resources that we do have. So we would have comparative advantage in a lot of different products in a lot of different areas. That's one of the things that we need to think about in terms of our future of our country. For a while, for instance, we believed back in the 70s that if we left our oil in the ground, we could import oil. But as we saw with the Yom Kippur War, we helped the Israelis militarily, and the Arabs didn't like it, so they cut off our oil supply. So that principle or that concept didn't really work very well. Secondly, there are technologies that differ by country, and therefore efficiency of production differs. Primarily, key example here is using robotics to build cars and other products. That development has resulted in some countries having a definite advantage in using robotics. We were slow in car manufacturing to use robotics. We learned a lot from the from the Japanese. And thirdly, products have a different appeal. We may, based on sophistication or preferences, we may prefer a product from another country. For instance, French wine rather than wine from Napa Valley in California, because we prefer the French taste, although Napa wine seems to be doing a lot better against foreign competition than it was before. Or the other thing is a foreign car, Porsche, Mercedes-Benz, BMW, all of those fancy cars that we prefer. If we have the money, maybe we want to buy it from a foreign country, okay, rather than try to settle for a Ford or something of that nature that's manufactured here in the States. So international trade has applications, and the basis of it are distribution resources. Technologies are different by country, and products have different appeal. So if we have the money, we may want to import something different. So colonialism was the key back in prior to World War II. And even after the period between World War I and World War II, colonialism was a pretty widespread concept. During World War II, of course, countries we'd never heard of were taken over and conquered by Germany, smaller countries around Europe. Particularly, therefore, though, in the Southeast, Japan, for instance, ran all over Southeast Asia, took over companies, or colonies rather, that belonged to Britain, France, Germany, Spain, the Netherlands, etc. So as a result of the Japanese takeover in the Far East, a lot of colonial empires that thought they were safe because they had the protection of the mother country, France, England, etc., found out that they weren't as safe as they thought they were. So as a matter of fact, Japan was on the verge of trying to invade Australia. We were fortunate enough to stop them on the land in a little island called Guadalcanal. And on the sea, we stopped them in a battle in 1942 in May, I believe, May or June of 1942, called the Battle of Midway, where the Japanese lost over 200 first-line pilots and 4 first-line carriers. And that seemed to be the turning point. Australia was saved and was never invaded. Okay, so colonialism, what was the concept under colonialism? Here's the concept. Basically, the European view of things was that the mother country, in this case, France or England, we'll use as an example, what they would do is the mother country would manufacture goods that the colonies needed, like clothing, foodstuffs, etc. And in turn, they would then take that from the colonies, and the colonies would pay for it with gold, silver, lumber, and other foodstuffs that would be sent back to the mother country. Now, the balance of trade, therefore, was in favor of the mother country. In other words, the colonial empires pretty much exploited these smaller countries that they had under their yoke or colonial empire. So the gold and silver went to the mother country in their treasury, and they forwarded goods and services, manufactured goods, to the colonies. And as I said, that worked for a while, but then people wanted to be free. They found out that they were not safe under a colonial empire as they thought they were. So things changed after World War II. So colonial ended at the end of World War II. Pretty much colonialism ended, as we saw earlier. India was given its independence in 1947. They hated the British. And a lot of countries at that point in time were absolutely cut loose from their colonial masters. So European nations with colonial empires could not manage nor control these far-flung colonies. Japanese invasions of these colonies pretty much proved to the local populace that the mother country could really not defend them against an aggressor from the outside. As a result, the Europeans had to allow their former colonies to engage in self-determination. This again is the case in 1947, with the biggest example is, of course, India and the efforts of Mahatma Gandhi to free India from the slavery engaged, or the thought of slavery that the British imposed, British rule on India itself. Oil-producing nations, states, and others were given self-determination as a result of providing the Allies with oil and, in some cases, troops. This is particularly true of the Far East, the oil-producing states. They were critical in the war because the Allies, for instance, wanted to make sure that Germany did not get their hands on Arab oil. So they did everything they could to make sure that the Arab countries remained within the Allied camp. So the post-war boundaries were drawn based on factors other than tribal, or therefore created some conflicts we see today in the Middle East. Let's talk about that for a minute. And I get a chance in class, I'll draw this out for you. But if you look at the Persian Gulf and you look at Persia, or what was Persia, the colonial empires or colonial countries went in, and giving these people independence, they drew boundaries for them. Now, in the case of Iran, they wanted to be sure they got the oil. So they put in place Reza Pahlavi, the Shah of Iran. He was later on overthrown, of course, but they did that in such a way that they wanted to make sure that the oil was maintained by the Shah of Iran, who was very partial to the free world or the industrialized world, and would be a good protector of their rights, their assumed rights to the oil in the Middle East. Of course, we know what happened, the revolution, etc. But one of the things they did in trying to determine and make sure that the Shah of Iran had control of the oil was they divided out Iraq and Iran separately. And in breaking it up, they ignored tribal factors. And that's critical. You look at Iraq today, for instance, you have the Kurds in the north, you have Sunni, you have Shia, you have three different tribes, all of them formed into a boundary called Iraq. And part of it is Iran, part of it is Saudi Arabia. But it's a mess. And a lot of the problems we have today in the Middle East are the result of how these boundaries were drawn and the reasoning behind the drawing of these boundaries. Now, the whole concept of comparative advantage came from a fellow named David Ricardo. He wrote in 1817, after he read 1776 book printed by and authored by Adam Smith, that he developed from that book and reading that book the laws of comparative advantage, or the principle of comparative advantage. His theory postulated the comparative advantage rather than absolute advantage fostered international trade. In other words, if you have absolute advantage, you own it all. If you have a comparative advantage, you own one thing and you do, or two things, and you do it very well. And that sets up the need for trade. So very few countries had absolute advantage in everything. Most countries had comparative advantage in some things. Some countries had comparative advantage in only one thing. Saudi Arabian oil, for instance. So he postulated that this would be the basis for international trade. Now, as we saw, we used in earlier chapters, we used the production possibilities curve to show that a country could produce or receive goods and services outside the curve with international trade. So it was important. So this led to the terms of trade where one good could be traded for another between two countries. That's called the terms of trade. Now the key of this is that the trade is free. In other words, you trade with me, I trade with you, I don't tax you, I don't interfere, I don't give you quotas, etc. So free trade was the key to David Ricardo's theory. So comparative advantage, we studied this earlier. It's the basis for international trade, again, a free trade environment. The free trade environment benefits everybody who's involved. So one country may have a comparative advantage over another, therefore the marginal cost is lower. In other words, the country with the comparative advantage in a product can produce and sell in the marketplace, the world market now. We're not just talking about a country's market, but can produce and sell in the world market at a price that's lower than other countries. That's the comparative advantage. So if you look at who will do what, the country with the lowest marginal cost or comparative advantage will be the exporter. The higher cost producer will be the importer, and he will have to purchase from the low-cost producer. All other things being equal, that's what he will want to do. So the high-cost producer will produce less and procure what he needs from the producer who has the comparative advantage or the lowest marginal cost. The nation with the lowest opportunity cost or marginal cost will become the exporter. The nation with the higher cost will become the importer. That's how international trade works, and that's how comparative advantage decides through economics who trades what with who. Okay? And the system works. So, as a result of the end of World War II, it was obvious that the world had changed dramatically. For instance, pound sterling, the British pound, was the key currency to international trade prior to World War II. After World War II, since we were the only country pretty much that wasn't devastated by the war, the US dollar became the trading currency of the world. So they got together and decided at Bretton Woods that the countries, the industrialized countries of the world, needed to form a World Trade Organization to help them manage trade. Now, this is no different than the colonies when the establishment of the original US, 13 original colonies. It's no different than those guys looking at their rivers, their oceans, and saying, you know what, I cannot regulate the Potomac River in Virginia with Maryland, we've got to find somebody who can set rules down and create, for instance, currencies and manage trade along these trade routes because they touch more than one state. So as a result, we formed the government that we call Washington, D.C., the federal government. Well, this is the same type of concept. The World Trade Organization was formed to help us implement free trade around the world among countries that we never knew existed before the war. So let's look at the organization. It came out of what's called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade in World War II. And again, I think the meeting was held in Bretton Woods, but it's commonly referred to as the GATT agreement. And the headquarters for this organization is Geneva, Switzerland, has 150 members and a small staff of 625 employees. The World Trade Organization has been extremely successful. In 1947, they set the basis for the first round of talks in Geneva with 23 countries attending. And they set up ground rules for how the world trade was going to be organized and how countries would trade with one another. And if something happened that didn't really fit the rules of world trade or free trade, there was a place to go to arbitrate a solution. So as a result of their efforts, world tariffs decreased from post-war era from 25% down to 4% of gross domestic product. So they had a huge impact on tariffs around the world. Currently, they're having meetings in Doha. Unfortunately, they're not getting a lot done. There are too many participants. The topics are too broad, and they've been in session since 2001, and they don't seem to be getting much done. But the basic foundation, the basic core of the World Trade Organization and how they operate is very, very good. So one of the things they were smart in doing was they made sure that these were the industrialized countries. Remember, they were setting this thing up, 23 countries attending, mostly the industrialized countries of the world. And they recognized at the time that, you know, we are lucky, we are developed, we have industries, we make products, we're more advanced than some of the other countries of the world. So what we've got to do is have in our charter for the World Trade Organization the option that if a country is developing and trying to develop a product of its own, they may be allowed to have special treatment with regards to tariff, etc. This is an effort to bring, it's called bootstrapping, to bring countries that are less developed up to higher standards or better standards, so to speak. So the World Trade functions. Let's look at those. Implementation, administration, operation of agreements. Now, if you have an agreement between a country or a group of countries, take for instance NAFTA, or a Trans-Pacific Partnership that we withdrew from. If you have these agreements and they're ratified by your administration, Congress, or parliaments, then those agreements then become part of the World Trade Organization. And they are kept on file with the World Trade Organization. And if there is a problem or a conflict with that agreement, the World Trade Organization can step in and rule in favor or against one or other countries. So they are the keeper of all of these agreements, and they are responsible for mitigating or arbitrating any conflicts that arise as a result of trade agreements. We're going through one now with NAFTA. So it provides a forum for negotiations and settling disputes. You don't have to go to war to solve a trade dispute like we used to prior to colonial times. We now have a forum to settle, to negotiate with people and to settle disputes. So the World Trade Organization therefore reviews and propagates international trade through national trade policies. So in effect, they're reaching into each individual country, taking their trade policies and using those policies to regulate world trade. They provide surveillance of these policies. And if one country has a complaint against another who's a member of the World Trade Organization, they can bring cause against that country in their court of appeal through the World Trade Organization. Pretty good concept. All right, so the principles of a trading system. Non-discrimination. You cannot discriminate. In other words, no most favored nation status. We cannot go to Brazil and say, Brazil, you've got the best coffee in the world. We will buy all your coffee. Don't sell to anybody else. Okay? And then in turn, Brazil, we will ship you all the, let's say, oil you need. So we will have a most favored nation status between Brazil and ourselves. Now, that's not allowed under the principles of the trading system set down by the World Trade Organization. So no most favored nation status. Reciprocity, elimination of free riding, attain better access to foreign markets. In other words, you just can't go and take what you want. You have to obtain access to these foreign markets. There's no such thing as having a special relationship in a foreign market that only you have. Agreements. Again, I said all agreements rest with the World Trade Organization. So those agreements then, once they're approved by your local Congress, or in the case of a lot of countries, a parliament, they become enforceable. And they are multilateral trade negotiations. They're enumerated in a schedule list of concessions. So all of this information is binding and enforceable by the World Trade Organization. That's again where you have a dispute with someone, you take it to the World Trade Organization and they will arbitrate it for you. Transparencies. All countries involved in world trade have to be transparent. They have to have open access to the World Trade Center for any information that the World Trade Center people need in order to set policy, arbitrate differences, respond requests for information. You have to notify the World Trade Organizations of any trade, any change in your trade policy. The members have to publish trade regulations. They have to review decisions affecting trade. All of this has to be provided to the World Trade Organization in order for this thing to work. And it does work. Safety valves, restricted measures for non-economic reasons. So we have to be sure that in all of this, we're fair. We have to be sure that we have fair competition and we trade we trade for economic reasons, not necessarily political. This is key. You've got to be careful because in a lot of cases, it may be politically expedient to go around this system. So one of the things they've done is to make sure that that doesn't happen. Okay? And therefore, they have safety valves. Okay, world trade. 1950, world trade was 7% of world's GDP. As I said earlier, by the mid-2000s, it's 25%. If it hadn't been for the Great Recession, it would probably be closer to 30% now, and it might be as we get closer. So at the same time, the U.S. has grown from 3% to 12% of world GDP. Most trade in the U.S., however, is not international trade, but trade between states. Florida has oranges. California has oranges. Okay, California and Florida provide most of the oranges to the other states. Wheat is produced in the Midwest. Wheat is traded throughout the states within the United States to make bread, etc. Okay? So there are states that have advantages in certain products, and most of the trade in the U.S. is called intra-trade. In other words, it's trade between the states based on the states' different resources. Now, one of the keys to this whole system is that high-income countries like the U.S. tend to trade less because we're more self-sufficient. And that kind of makes sense. We're lucky. We've got a lot of resources in this country. The country itself is very big, and we're not really a big trader. We are very, very self-sufficient. We can provide most of the things we need within ourselves. Our Achilles heel at one time was oil, but we seem to have taken care of that problem lately with fracking, etc. Okay, impact of the Great Recession on world trade. Let's take a look at that. This is statistics put out by the World Bank. So you'll see down the left-hand column the countries that they measured. China, Canada, South Korea, United Kingdom, Venezuela, United States, Germany, etc., and Russia. So exports as a percent of world GDP in 2006, before the Great Recession hit in 2008, as an average, we were 28.2%, almost 30%. But as of 2009, a year after, we're down to about 24%. And you can look at what happened to China, for instance. They were 39%, they dropped down to 27. Canada was 36, they dropped down to 29. Again, they are big trading partners of the US. And when the US was hit so hard by the Great Recession, we cut back on our purchases overseas. South Korea continued to grow. The UK held about the same. Venezuela dropped significantly. US, we stayed the same. We're not a big exporter. Germany dropped. Hong Kong dropped. Saudi Arabia dropped. And Russia dropped. Excuse me. So all of these areas experienced a reduction in trade as a result of the Great Recession, which started in September 2008. Okay, moving on. Trade barriers and export subsidies. Let's look at what causes problems. Tariffs. A revenue tariff is applied to imports into a country. For instance, it's a way that governments can raise money, get cash. They put a revenue tariff on a product being imported, and they in turn are able to collect cash and put it in the corporate treasury, country's treasury. There's also a protective tariff, which is used to protect domestic producers from foreign sources, imported automobiles, tires, for instance. It's very important for Firestone to be able to protect their business. So protective tariffs at one time or another have been put in for automobile tires. And then there are quotas. In other words, the way a quota works is that they put a quota into a country and they say, all right, you guys, we will allow you to import or export to our country 10,000 units. If you go beyond that number, we're going to fine you or put a tariff on your products. So that's how the quota works. Then there are non-tariff barriers. This was used in the case of India. It's called licensing. It's important that you get a license in order to import into the country. The problem is it's very difficult to get the license. Okay, they have onerous quality standards. That's the way to protect their country and keep the products out. Next, we have voluntary export restrictions, VERs, which have the same effect as quotas. Excuse me. Okay, so VERs have the same effect as quotas do. I'm having a tough time here with my throat. Export subsidies, another one. The way that works is that the government says, all right, we want you to export into the world market. So what we're going to do for you is we're going to give you some money to make it cheaper cost-wise. For instance, if we want you to export wheat to other countries of the world, we will give you $2 per bushel. And that way your cost will be $2 less than the world market. And you'll be able to sell in the world at a lower price. All right, global suppliers. Look at those. I showed you this earlier. This is the Bombardier plane, and you can see where parts come from. It's made in Canada. Canada provides some of it. Japan provides a piece. The UK provides another piece. European Union, and also the United States. We looked at that earlier in the course, so I won't spend any time on it. So what is globalization? Globalization describes the process where regional economies, societies, and cultures have become integrated through communication, transportation, and trade. This is key. This is where we all work together and we become a trading partner with all the other countries of the world. It's an excellent way to improve your own society, the well-being of your people, and in effect, you can produce product or get product into your country beyond the production possibilities curve or production possibilities frontier. So globalization has arrived because of elements or things, actions that were taken by countries to improve trade relations among countries, including the World Trade Organization. So integration is what the result is of globalization. The old expression, if the United States sneezes, Brazil catches a cold. All right, so the term is closely economic globalization. It's the integration of national economies through trade, foreign direct investment, capital flows, migration, spread of technology, and military presence. Again, military presence as a result of World War II started this whole thing going, particularly the World Trade Organization. Now, there are different types of trade. We can buy stock or goods in foreign countries. We can invest in foreign stock markets. So not only do we trade product, but we can also trade capital. We can buy products. We can buy stock in companies in foreign countries. A lot of foreign countries list stocks on our stock markets. They're called ADRs. Okay? So all of this integration comes not only in product, but also in capital flows. It also occurs through migration, people moving from one place to another. It also occurs through the spread of technology and military presence. All right, I showed you this chart before, globalization, diminishing, and this is the background to it. Diminishing the role of nation state. Combinations of nations trading, one becomes dependent on the other. In other words, they don't lose, they lose the ability to determine their own fate. Secondly, social dumping. Production goes to the country with the lowest labor rate. This is a problem today with Mexico versus the United States and China versus the United States. The labor rate in the US, manufacturing-wise, probably about $35 an hour. In China, it may be $5, $10 an hour. A big, big difference. Same is true in Mexico. Labor rate in Mexico is a lot lower than the US. The gulf between rich and poor nations. One of the problems is a lot of people feel that through trade, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Okay? That's called the gulf between rich and poor nations. And a lot of people criticize globalization, saying that what it does is the richer nations continue to make more and the poorer nations remain poor. Not necessarily get poorer, but remain poor. Non-controllable immunities. This is a big one. This is a governmental political thing. The people that are involved, let's say in General Electric, build product in a lot of countries around the world. They're currently setting up manufacturing in India, having some difficulty, but they're trying to set up manufacturing in India. A lot of these countries are concerned that these multilaterals will have too much of an influence on their own political system. In other words, they become so powerful, they use their money to control politicians within their own country and get what they want out of the governments. And lastly, environmental destruction. We've seen this in China in spades. The growth of economic growth in China, industrialization, has resulted to a large extent on environmental problems. Air quality, water quality are huge problems in China today. Okay, barriers to globalization. Lots of them. You need transportation networks, both internally and externally. We're fortunate here, huge container ships can dock in Washington, in California. Now huge container ships can go through the Panama Canal and even deliver product to the East Coast ports that can handle the depth of these huge ships. Now, they also have different legal tax systems. If you're going to do business in a foreign country, you need to either recruit an organization within that country that understands the legal terminology and the legal system and also the tax systems, right? A lot of people, a lot of companies, particularly in the US, that move into a foreign country will form partnerships or contract with companies, local companies, rather than try to learn the whole system themselves and provide all the expertise within their own country, because there are so many other barriers to worry about. Language, for once, which is a barrier. Okay, so you're better off doing business with a local organization to get you through the legal and tax systems of a particular country, because language can become a barrier. The Chinese language versus the US language, etc. Different currencies. That's not a big a problem as it used to be. I'll go through in a minute. I'll show you some of the things that go on now in the world market. We have a trading system for currencies that's basically an internet type of trading system. It's called Forex or FX, and we trade currencies between one another. Corporations use it, governments use it. It's a great way to convert currencies and get business transactions done efficiently and quickly. And we'll go through that. Remaining trade barriers. Not everything's been broken down. Some of it still exists. It exists for different reasons. We, for instance, placed 24% tariff on all imports of sugar from Brazil. Brazil produces sugar a lot cheaper than we do, but we wanted to make sure that we could benefit our own farmers, particularly obtaining sugar from corn. So we put a tariff in on Brazilian sugar, 25%, I think it was. Fortunately, that tariff expired and was not renewed. The result of that tariff, by the way, was pretty devastating. We produce corn and we use corn to make ethanol. And what happened was corn was also being used for cattle, pigs, etc., livestock. And what it ended up doing was driving up the price of our own livestock within our own country because too much of the corn was being used to make ethanol. You got to be careful of these things. For every action, there's a reaction. You better know or understand what the reaction is going to be. There are cultural differences, very, very, very important. I know when we first started to do business in Japan, cultural differences were hard and very difficult to understand. We had to learn their differences and what their differences were. If we were having a business meeting with a Japanese group, we would think, for instance, that we might have a deal because they didn't say no. In effect, what they do is they have to think about it before they'll give you a complete answer. And that is something that, as Americans, we're not used to dealing with. Let's get the deal done. Let's move quickly, et cetera, et cetera. Although other cultures don't like to move as quickly as we do. Okay, all of this stuff, these barriers add up to about 25% of the cost. The cost of shipment or trade, international trade. Now, that means that trade still goes on in spite of that cost. So it's pretty efficient, right? So even though it's 25% added to the cost, it's still more efficient to trade worldwide. All right, I mentioned foreign exchange trading. They list that as a barrier. But what's developed over time because of globalization and as a result of globalization, we have had to put together an efficient system to trade currencies. So what developed was the Forex or foreign exchange system. And the way it works is, let's use an example. Let's say, for instance, that you have $2,000 to invest and you think the euro is going to go up against the dollar. So here's what you do. You think an entry point is the euro at $1.45. You buy 1,000 units. Now, Because currencies don't move in big dollar amounts, the marketplace gives you 50 units for every dollar. So for $2,000, you can get leverage into 100,000 units of foreign exchange currencies. It's a pretty slick system in that you can also stop loss. So let's assume that in your case, you think the entry price is good at 1.45, but you're a little bit leery that I might be wrong. So what they do is they say, okay, I'm going to put in a stop loss. I'm going to buy at 1.45, but if it goes below 1.446, I want you to sell me out. Automatically done, traded on the internet in an exchange. So you limit your loss to $400. You can also limit your profit. One of the things you got to be careful of in investing is know what level you're going to take a loss and at what level you're going to get out and take a profit. That's easy to do in this Forex trading market. You can set up a take profit order. Let's say you think you buy at 1.45, you think it's going to go to 1.46. That will earn you $1,000. You say, okay, automatically, don't have to do anything. If it reaches 1.46, sell me out. Commissions are low. For this type of typical transaction, you'd pay $20 in commissions. So it's a pretty slick system. But this has developed as a result of globalization. It's very important trading. All right, most traded currencies throughout the world, US dollar, 84.9% of all the trades are in US dollars. The euro, second highest, 39%. Japanese yen, 19%. These are very, very popular currencies that people traded. The pound sterling, the British pound, 13%. Australian dollar down to 7%. Swiss franc, 6%. Canadian dollar, 5%. Hong Kong dollar, 2.4%. All others, 24.2%. Now, this all adds up to 200%. $64,000 question is, how in the heck can it add up to 2%? Well, it's pretty simple. For every trade in currency, there's an offsetting trade in another currency. So every trade involves two currencies. There's two sides to every transaction, and they're both currencies. So everything that's traded in the world adds up to about 200%. All right, now how do countries manage their currencies? It's very important to many countries, to manage their own exchange rate, because it either adds to or decreases the price of their products. For instance, if the exchange rate in the US goes up, that means that products that we sell to other countries are higher priced because of the increase in the value of the dollar. If the value of the dollar declines, the price of our goods are cheaper. So lower exchange rates result in more exports. Higher exchange rates result in less. However, the corollary is also true. If we have a low exchange rate, okay, foreign goods are very expensive to us. If we have a higher exchange rate, foreign goods are cheaper to us. So be sure you understand there are two sides to that argument, two sides to that coin, right? So there are three and a half types of currencies that are traded in the marketplace. The one method of trading currencies is the floating rate. Now, floating rate means that the country's exchange rate is not interfered with by the country itself. Countries that trade this way are the US dollar, the European euro, the British pound sterling, the Japanese yen. And this is the strategy most countries, large developed countries, follow. And what it means is that this, we're not going to go in and interfere in the marketplace for the US dollar. Or we're Germany, or we're not going to interfere with the value of the euro. Japan, we're not going to interfere with the value of the yuan or the pound sterling. And what it means is that it's left to trade, and whatever it's at, it's at. Nobody does anything different. In the case of some countries, though, that's not the case. For instance, China. Let's look at how they do it. Well, first, there's a fixed, okay, so we got a floating where the countries let their currency float. Whatever it trades at the world market price, that's what it is, vis-a-vis other countries. And as the IMF has said, 35 countries float their currencies. The other method of handling currencies is a fixed, where strong government action is used to prevent a move. Now, fixed, for instance, is oil. Oil is priced everywhere in the world at US dollars. You cannot buy oil without buying in dollars. You can't buy oil with euros. You have to convert those euros to dollars first, and then you can buy oil. So that's a fixed exchange rate or a fixed currency. The other is called a soft peg. And a subset of that is the system that China uses, which is a cradling peg. A soft peg means that the country's treasury, in this case, People's Bank of China, is going to intervene in the marketplace to make sure that their currency stays low so that the goods and services they sell to us and the other countries around the world remain relatively cheap. The IMF has estimated, and this was a couple of years ago, that the Chinese yuan, Chinese currency, is undervalued by about 36%. That means that they have a price advantage because of how they manipulate their currency by about a third against the rest of the world. Okay? That's become a hot issue politically in this country. And I'm sure we're going to hear more about it, but you guys need to be tuned into what's going on in this whole area. A cradling peg, which is pretty much what China uses. And what they do is they say, I have an upper band of how high I want my currency to get, or I have a lower band of how low I want it to get. So I'm going to move in and affect the market if it goes or gets too close to that high level I want or that low level. Now, for instance, the People's Bank of China, if it starts to get too high, will go in, okay, and they'll put more of their currency into the marketplace. So what they will do is they will buy their currency. If it gets too low, they'll sell. Well, what they want to do is increase the volume, supply and demand of yuan in the marketplace. Remind me in class and I'll go through. It's difficult to explain without drawing it on the board. So it will, we'll get in class, remind me, and I'll show you how that cradling peg works. All right, then there's protectionism, and there are reasons for protectionism in world trade. Military secrets. I think I went through this in an earlier chapter. National defense. We don't want to trade away our secrets. Diversification. It may be important to diversify. Okay, the Saudis would love to diversify, but they really have a single product. Cuba the same way, sugar. Okay? If they need to diversify, they've got to find ways to produce other products at a low cost. Infant industry production. Let's assume you're a developing country and you're trying to expand an industry within your country, whatever it may be. Let's say it's the manufacture of small steel parts, and you have a cottage industry, an industry starting in your country. You may want to protect and not let people import into your country goods and services that meet what you're producing yourself. so that there is no foreign competition. You develop the industry within your own country and you sell within your own country. So infant industry is another argument for engaging in protectionism. Protectionism in this case meaning putting tariffs up. Dumping, protection against dumping by another country. Selling into a country below cost. Dumping sometimes is used by governments like subsidies. The example I gave you before was $2 a bushel of wheat. Therefore, if I give you $2 a bushel of wheat, your cost is less than the world market, and you can develop or sell into the world market at a lower price than anybody else, because I, the government, have given you some money to go out and do that. Domestic employment protection. Jobs are lost to foreign competition. We know this one in spades. Okay. As a result of our employment level being so high, for instance, Ford is going to move a plant to build a Ford Focus in Mexico and export it back into the US, primarily because the labor rate is lower in Mexico. Now, this is important thing to think about because we have lost a lot of jobs, particularly manufacturing, to foreign competition because labor rates are so much lower. Our labor rates include FICA taxes, retirement plans, health plans, etc. A lot of countries don't provide those same kinds of protections to their employees. As a result, in a lot of foreign countries like China, for instance, they save up to 40% of their income in savings. Here, it's about 5%. The reason it's low here is that we have all these other protections built in, which has raised our labor rate, but it makes us feel safer. In China, they have no protection. If they get sick and go to the doctor, they have to pay the doctor. So as a result, they save at a higher level than, for instance, we do, because they don't have insurance and we probably do. Okay, now comparative advantage. We've talked about that. We've talked about the advantages of it, but there's some also criticisms of it. So let's go through and let's look at the other side of the coin. All right, can competitive advantage be consistently maintained? Here's an interesting argument. If, as a result of comparative advantage, you say that I can produce this product and sell it into the world market at a lower price than anybody else. All right, one of the things is, can you maintain that price in the long run to the exclusion of everybody else? Or will you eventually hit the law of diminishing returns and your cost will be driven up? But as a result of we set you up with a comparative advantage and you took advantage of it, does it last forever? That's a big question. The other piece, we studied elasticity. Is the product elastic or inelastic? In other words, does it respond readily to a change in demand? Or is it very inelastic? It's not going to move much. And lastly, technology. Change is comparative advantage. Technology comes along and everything changes. Technology has a huge impact. We trace this through the development of the microchip. One time we were all using towers and PCs. Then we shifted to laptops. Now we're getting the same kind of capability in cell phones. All because of technology reducing the size of components needed to store memory and do logical steps. All right, so current trends toward large-scale trade agreements between countries tend to make mistakes. For instance, Trans-Pacific Partnership had multiple countries, with the exclusion of China, in the Pacific Rim, and it was between us and them. Now, can you realistically say that we can put together a trade agreement and everybody's got comparative advantage taken care of in that trade agreement? Very difficult. Very difficult to envision how we can equally treat so many different countries from the standpoint of comparative advantage. Comparative advantage in that case might mean that we are taken advantage of. So as a result, we withdrew from Trans-Pacific Partnership. It was too big to manage. All right, NAFTA, a lot of talk about NAFTA now. They're in renegotiation of the NAFTA treaty, trying to settle up some differences between Canada, Mexico, and the US. We know, of course, Mexico has a lot lower labor rate. Canada probably doesn't, but Mexico certainly does. But then you look at another concept, and that is the chart I showed you on corporate tax rates. Canada, Mexico, and the US, we have the highest tax rate of those two countries. We're at 35%. Canada is nominally at 25%, including province taxes, and Mexico is about 30%. None of that differential, which affects the price you're able to set at in the world market, was taken into account in agreeing the NAFTA treaty. Okay? So it's become probably, hopefully, I'm not privy to the negotiations. Hopefully, it's part of the negotiation that's going on now. People in Mexico and Canada have to understand these differences. I think we'll get a lot further along with Canada than we will Mexico. But the fact that, for instance, Ford Motor Company finds it cheaper to leave Ohio and manufacture cars in Mexico and then re-import those cars back into the US is not, to me, not sound economic thinking, but that's up to you guys. You guys think about what you want. You're the future, I'm the past. Okay, that's it for now. We'll your quiz is next Tuesday. The quiz is 60 questions, and we'll have some time for review before you take, I'm sorry, quiz, I'm talking your midterm exam. Your midterm is next Tuesday. We'll have some time to do some review. You have your questions to go over. One of the smartest things you can do is form groups to go over those questions, because not everybody knows the answers to all of them, but working in a group, you can get to a lot of the answers a lot quicker. So anyway, good luck on that test, and we'll take some time in class to do some review. So I'll send this off to you as soon as it finishes processing.